Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Cartier webinar on funding your business. We're so excited to have everybody here. I am here with three of my favorite people in the world, three amazing female founders and innovators who are looking to solve some really important problems in this world, something that we all need to pay attention to. Solving problems not just for women, but for all of us. So I'm going to let my panel here this morning. I'm Shelly Porges, by the way, first of all, to introduce myself. I am the co-founder and managing partner of the $1 Billion Fund for Women. We are a global consortium of venture funds pledged to invest more into women-founded companies. And we are delighted to have this conversation this morning with three great female founders and innovators. Thank you. And I'm going to ask Emily to start out with first her introduction. Emily Levy, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Levy. I'm based here in Providence, Rhode Island, in the United States. I founded my company out of my own need as a patient battling chronic neurological Lyme disease and having to live with multiple medical devices. I started my business while an undergrad at Babson College, where I had a scholarship for women's entrepreneurial leadership, and I've been running my company full-time ever since.
Great. And you want to tell us the name of your company is?
Oh, sorry. My company's name is Mighty Well, and our vision is to be the Under Armour of healthcare.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Next, let's move to Caitlin Dolkart. Caitlin, would you share with us your vision?
Hi, everyone. My name's Caitlin. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, so it's in East Africa. And we started Flare 2.5 years ago. So 2/3 of the world does not have an existing 911 system, meaning that when you need help in an emergency, you literally have no one to call. And so we've been operational for the last 2.5 years throughout Kenya and operate the largest network of ambulance providers.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, really appreciate that. And Aline, please share with us your story.
Yes. So hi, my name is Aline Sara, and I am Lebanese American. And I spend my time between Beirut, Paris, and New York for the most part. And what we do is we are trying to help refugees access an income regardless of their location and work status and living status. With over 65 million people who are forced to flee their homes today, we are facing the worst refugee crisis of our time, and the vast majority of these individuals struggle to access an income, no matter how educated they are. So we do that by leveraging the gig economy and their native language skills, and we hire them as online tutors and translators.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, you three are just amazing, all of you, really, with what you're doing. And Aline, I'll just say, as the daughter of refugees from Nazi Europe, I really appreciate what you're doing. I know we're going to hear more about the amazing work you're doing. At least I hope to hear more, and I'm sure that our audience does as well. Beyond that, though, let's hop right to the topic. Our focus this morning is when we have extraordinary innovations that the world really needs. How do we get them funded? How do we scale them? And what are the options for funding? So maybe I'm going to ask each one of you in turn to start sharing with us not only how you've brought your company to this point as you've applied for the Cartier Women's Initiative Awards, something truly extraordinary.
So I remember watching a TED Talk about what makes a startup successful, and it was really interesting. The result of the researcher highlighted timeliness of bringing your company to life as a really big factor. And I would say that NaTakallam, which means we speak in Arabic, because we were born focusing on Syrian refugees. So we came to life at a time where there was a heightened awareness to the refugee crisis and a heightened need. And so I would say that NaTakallam has really been able to benefit from the attention to this topic with regards to our funding situation. So we are a combination of self-generated revenue and funds that we've raised through competition and grant money. So we've been able to raise over $500,000 in grants and competition money. And that's been a combination of foundation, but also pitch competitions. So our team has been very strategic about seeing these opportunities and seeing our compatibility. And just the fact that people are really interested in a number of factors that we are touching on, which is refugee issues, livelihood access, leveraging the internet to provide solutions, and really looking at the humanitarian and development space with a new and kind of disruptive approach. So we were lucky enough to be very active in this space for now, up until now. And we also, from the minute we came to life, we were generating revenue because we sell language classes, and people started signing up. So that's been how we've been doing it so far. Of course, the founders, we bootstrapped a bit at first, but luckily our capital costs were relatively low. So I would say that's been NaTakallam's journey. And now it's really, we realize that there's a huge potential for our work. And so now we're looking at different, more significant income sources and opportunities to scale.
Great. That's wonderful. I mean, I really appreciate your highlighting, the various streams of, sourcing funding. And you start out by talking about self-generated. We often talk about driving the growth in your business with customer revenues, but I do understand that in your case, your direct customers are not folks who they may have had assets in their past, but having had to flee countries, may not have assets any longer. And so that becomes a unique and interesting challenge that you have, even as you're trying to move forward. So thank you for that. Great. Caitlin, would you share with us how you built your business and what you've used to drive it?
Yeah, so I'd say that not too atypical of a path. So we were initially funded from MIT through a grant from them. And then we've kind of graduated along the way. So to date, we've raised just over $3 million, majority of which is from angel investors, venture capital, impact funds, and then now strategics. So we've raised 3 different rounds of funding. We've had our pre-seed, seed, and we are gearing up for our Series A funding. So I would say right now we have more than 25 private investors. So that's been definitely a challenge of just managing all of these different interests and coming up with a strategy, because that's a lot of people to keep in the know and keep invested after the fact as well. So we intend to continue to raise quite a bit of private capital, since our product is, if you think about 911, actually more similar to like building roads and systems. There's a lot of infrastructure that you need up front to be able to then really realize those profitable gains later on. So we continue to intend to raise quite a bit of private money.
Emily, do you want to share with us what you've been doing to really advance your business?
Sure, absolutely. So with Mighty Well, our space is called adaptive wear. And we see this really as the next segment in the apparel industry, the same way that maternity wear is $1 billion business, as is plus size. Adaptive wear is for both patients and people with physical disabilities. And this market has really been underserved and ignored by mainstream fashion and direct-to-consumer brands. So just like Aline, we are generating revenue directly through selling of our physical products and digital content. But we have also gone the route of pitch competitions as well. They are time consuming, but they really have helped to bring attention to what we're doing and to help us be seen as thought leaders in our space, which has been amazing. And then from those pitch competitions, we were introduced to a number of VCs and angels. So in our seed 1 round, we've raised $550,000 through a convertible note as well as a safe. But interestingly enough, I think, which is different from the other women in this conversation, we actually did an equity crowdfunding campaign, which is relatively new in the funding space. And we were one of the first people to go live on Republic, which is a platform. And it was part of doing a TV show, which was kind of like Shark Tank, hosted by Tim Draper. So, we've used a number of areas for funding the business to date. It is definitely our largest challenge and most time-consuming area of the business. And, at the end of the day, we just want to grow it, and we're really doing whatever we can to get it off the ground.
And that is, so first of all, in terms of how we fund our businesses, first and foremost, a founder's own resources. wherever that might come from. That's been traditional. Second of all, of course, friends and family. If you're lucky enough to have friends and family who are able to, in many communities, that doesn't work very well. Thirdly, Emily mentioned crowdfunding. That can be an essential thing. And of course, the model of crowdfunding is new in its current form. That is equity crowdfunding that Emily mentioned. But crowdfunding as a principle, as a way of pooling capital in order to support and scale a business is not entirely new. And then finally, you mentioned as well, Emily, and maybe Caitlin, you may have as well, angel investing. We talked about that is finding individuals who, again, have capacity. They may not be in your friends and family circle, but others who see the value of the innovation that you're trying to bring to market and trying to scale. Because we're talking really do the shout about non-dilutive grant funding through competitions. And Emily, you mentioned, and others mentioned that, that is sometimes very time consuming. But the beauty of it is that that is what it takes. It takes an investment of your time, not so much of your resource, your financial resources, and it translates to funding that does not dilute your ownership stake in the company. That's why we call it non-dilutive grant funding. So whether it's winning an award from a competition, winning a grant from a foundation's application process or other RFP, but those are all an array of things that we can. Have any of you ever experienced gender bias, do you think, when seeking funding so far?
Definitely.
Anybody want to jump in on that?
I'll tell a quick story because we straddle both the apparel industry and the medical device industry. Being a young woman directly out of undergrad and in the Boston area, which is filled with MIT and Harvard grads, many of the meetings that I had early on with male older investors, they kind of looked at me and said, "Why are you here?" And that was very discouraging to hear those type of attitudes and even just body language. And it took, a lot of time to almost rebuild my self-confidence, which I had never thought was a problem for myself. So I think those things happen every single day, especially when you're forming a new segment of an industry.
So in a way, to feedback, you're talking about both gender bias and probably age bias. Like, they can't imagine someone so young being as thoughtful, capable, innovative, and able to build a business that they would want to put their money into.
Correct.
Caitlin, could you comment on that? And what have you experienced?
Yes, so many things. To be honest, I feel like I was lucky throughout my entire career never to have felt like gender bias until I started raising money. And it comes in all different formats, from the fact that we're two female founders, we're a technology company. So again, we had to do a lot of creative strategies of, I mentioned like maybe 10 times in the introduction, Maria, who's the other founder, that she's a software developer. She's an engineer, because everyone's always like, "Oh, but it's so great. You have this amazing tech product, but who's behind it?" And you're sitting right next to the person who's behind it. So stuff like that. So we combat it oftentimes by preempting those questions, or she will oftentimes introduce me, because the other point that people feel is like, "Oh, you must not know finances, and we've raised a ton of money." So then people are like, "Oh, how are you going to manage that money?" So Maria oftentimes then similarly will be like, "Well, Caitlin is, she worked in finance for the last decade," like, and try to, again, kind of, I think the reality is, and it kind of just sucks, but the majority of investors are white men. And they oftentimes, when they choose not to invest, it's because something doesn't feel right. And I think that's actually what's so amazing, Shelly, is like, I do think part of it, obviously men need to kind of get to the other side and realize how important it is to have diversity in their portfolio, but we do need more female investors. Our very first set of investors, so as I said, we raised a bit of money from MIT who backed us, but our first 5 investors, who we're so proud of, were all women. And they all had started companies in the US, and they got it. They trusted us. There wasn't that issue of like, "Oh, you seem weird and I just can't tell. Your business is amazing, but something seems off." They connected with us. Since then, sadly, every other investor is a white male. All of venture capital, still, we have not yet found any VC or strategic funding that's headed by women. So we continue to kind of combat that. But yeah, like I said, the biggest thing that we do is we try to get out in front of it. And so like we know what they care about. So we know that they're super concerned that we have someone who can do tech or someone who can do finance. And like we address it from the beginning. We're like, hey, we know you've never invested in females before. This is how we are. We're nothing different than you guys. So let's just move on.
Unlike you, I appreciate those men who are investing in women, and we have a number of them in our portfolio in our $1 billion Fund for Women Consortium. And, you know, we want to encourage them. And, you know, interestingly, mostly they're men with daughters, and they may never have thought about it until they had daughters. But once they have daughters, mothers, obviously, some of them have wives. But not until they have daughters do they start thinking about how unequal this world is and how opportunities are not there. It's not that the outcomes aren't equal, it's the opportunities aren't equal, that their daughters are not going to have the same opportunities as their sons do. And I've literally heard men say this to me. When I had a daughter, I started realizing I want my daughter to have the same opportunities my son has. If they have a son, you know, so that's part one. The other thing I wanted to react to was also your point about, you know, what's obviously, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, unintended, or, you know, as we all call it, unconscious bias. Although in many cases, it's very clear it's very conscious bias. And I feel like we need a global campaign. You know, Geraldine Ferraro many years ago, who was a candidate for vice president many years ago with Baltimore, she says some leaders are born women. And I feel like we need this big campaign that shows the world this is what an engineer looks like, because we need a major reboot on how we see who gets to be what.
So I think for NaTakallam, it's an interesting, you know, journey.
Yes,
we have not gone the VC route or the angel investor route to date. And so we've really just focused on the competition space and the foundations. And so I would say I haven't had to deal too much with being in a room of typical investors and kind of what that can, you know, reveal in terms of biases. That being said, I have had a few opportunities as part of trainings I've been in. And so I would say that beyond the, you know, the gender and the age bias, I would say we've definitely seen industry bias as well as political bias. NaTakallam is sadly in the world today, when you work with refugees, it becomes politicized and people associate it with politics. So I, you know, already, I guess because of that, and because of my background coming from the more humanitarian space, you know, when you're in front of VCs, that's already, you know, you can already tell that creates a certain reaction. So for me, it's almost like I've already prepared myself for that, and I choose to not spend too much time in a space that I feel will not be receptive. And so I've, you know, strategically, I'm very careful with how I'm, you know, who I'm asking to get money from, what competition spaces we're in. And as we move forward, you know, whether we go the VC route or other routes of investments, such as lots of new foundations who are doing investments in mission-driven for-profits, you know, we're really looking into all that to see where it is worth actually, you know, spending time to try and fundraise. And so I would actually say that as a woman, taking that approach has been in our favor, because there have been so many new competitions and opportunities like Cartier want to push women and support them as they launch businesses. So in that respect, I would say that being a woman has helped. And again, so my experience is very different than having gone through many, you know, more traditional VCs. And so that's been, you know, it's an interesting, you know, it's been an interesting experience in that sense.
You know, when we think about that, you know, obviously we may face whatever kinds of challenges we face, whether it has to do with gender bias or any other thing. But what do you think are some of the kind of mistakes that entrepreneurs make when they're seeking funding? I mean, what first of all, share with us if you feel like you've done something that in retrospect, you know, if you knew now, if you knew then what you know now about venture or not even just venture. Emily, you want to start with that?
Sure. So the first thing I'd like to add is I think when I started off on this journey 2 years ago and we knew that we'd have to raise outside funding, I really tried to like fit the mold of what I thought these older white men wanted to hear. And I felt like I walked out of those meetings sometimes not feeling like I was true to myself. But really, after taking a step back and, working with the mentors that I have in my corner and just being, stick in the ground saying, this is who we are. This is what we believe in. This is what we're going after. You either believe in what we're doing, you believe in the team, you believe in, the triple bottom line, or you don't. So that was one of the things I think I learned early on. And as well, I wanted to make sure that, we're talking about a population of people who are underserved. They typically have a physical or mental disability, and people don't always know what that looks like. So I think I wish earlier on, I used very clear images of the people that we're impacting, and this is how we're doing it, and this is why we're doing it. Because what we noticed was, if someone never met someone with a chronic condition or lived with someone with a disability, they didn't always resonate with our message. So those are two of the things that I wish I learned earlier in the process, as well as just thinking big, from day one. When we started, we have PICC line covers. So they're basically armbands for people with long-term medical devices. And we just thought we were going to be the best in the world at creating that one specific product. But as we got into the market, more and more people said, I have a port, or I have a feeding tube, or I'm in a wheelchair. Like, what can you make for me? So I wish from day one we thought as big as possible and built the company from there.
Brilliant. And then I love the idea that you demoed, your target audience, you demoed the conditions of your target audience for an audience that might find it hard to relate to, since, the audience that finds it hard to relate to may be the ones with the resources, whereas you have to, help them align with. But mostly, I really loved your point about being true to yourself and recognizing that, when you take on funders, whatever kind of funders they may be, you're essentially entering into a long-term relationship, not to call it a marriage. That may be a step too far, but something akin to that. And so if that person isn't supportive of you in every way, in whatever ways they can be, not just with their capital, but with their contacts and every other thing that they have to offer you. That's not just, but even though you may be feeling at the moment desperate for money, you've got to know that there's got to be an alignment there. So being true to yourself, both personally in the way you present yourself, but most importantly in how you represent what the company is and what it can do, and importantly, the impact it can have, is very critical. And to your point, hey, if you don't get it, if you don't see it, fine, we move on. And P.S., as we were building the $1 billion fund for, we announced on October 11th, just yesterday, we passed the 700 million mark for pledges. If someone didn't get what we were trying to do, if a VC just didn't get it and or didn't feel aligned and or didn't feel passionate, we said, fine, sorry you're not ready. If you ever are ready, you'll know where to find us. We'll follow up with you periodically. But, we found so many people enthused about what we were doing, recognizing the problem we were trying to solve, as you are, as all of you are, that's the critical thing. That's what propels you forward. That's what gives you inspiration on tough days, right? And so, those are 3 great lessons. Thank you.
Thank you.
Caitlin, do you want to add to that your thoughts on what you've learned and where you see people making mistakes?
Yeah, absolutely. And Emily, I love your examples. I definitely connect with both of those. So not to repeat those, but I guess a few just like other random tidbits along the way. One is I love raising from investors who have been entrepreneurs. So that's a profile that I actually look for, is if they've run their own company. Every investor brings something different to the table, but I find that former entrepreneurs can really help you along some of the rockier paths and also provide a lot of support. So I very much look for that. I think the other is just don't be afraid to set the terms. So when we raised our first round, we waited for the term sheet to come in. And we let the investors set it, and then we were disappointed by it and scrap the whole deal. And ever since that point, we set the terms from the beginning. So when we raise a round, we say, okay, this is what the valuation. So we've raised all on convertible notes and convertible equity. So we set, here's the valuation cap, here's the tenure of the note, and so we did all of the market research and benchmarking to say these are fair terms. We know they are based on our revenue, based on our customer numbers and all of that. So we set everything from this day forward. We don't let an investor actually tell us. And so that also makes it clear, like from the beginning, you're in or you're out. Like, yes, you agree on our vision, but also here are the terms that we want, and we're not going to let you kind of push us aside. So I think that's the other thing is even if you're not a finance person, you can set the terms and you can tell them what you want because it's your company. And yeah, and then I guess the last one, Shelly, you mentioned, but tell investors no. The last round, we actually had a really horrible round. We had these investors where from the very beginning, I had this feeling, I was just like, there's something about them I just don't connect with. And it's kind of like dating. It's like sometimes those aren't going to work out. And so we went for 6 months, like going back and forth, ping ponging. I have no idea how many questions they asked us, but like thousands of questions. And I could always just sense there was something in it that they just didn't believe in. But I also wasn't feeling them. And it's hard to sometimes always articulate, but we ended up saying no to them. And they were so stunned that they came back, they like improved the terms and all these things. But when you're done, you're done. So we moved on from them. So I guess also no money. Don't take money if you actually feel like something's wrong with them, because you are giving a piece of your company to them and you're going to have to deal with them. So if they're annoying during due diligence, they're going to be annoying afterwards as well.
So I think that's a great point. You know, sometimes when investors ask you questions, you can learn from them, right? I mean, there are things that will help you advance yourself.
Yeah.
And there are other kinds of, to your point, annoying questions and or superfluous questions that at this stage of our engagement, these questions make no sense. You know, you don't need to know this to make your decision. Yeah. All of those kinds of questions. So, I mean, I do think it's important to be judicious. You know, we have found, you know, first of all, I've been both a serial entrepreneur and investor, et cetera. And so seeing it from both sides, I'm trying to use my questions to articulate something about their business we generally need to know in order to make a decision. And hopefully we come across authentically. And I don't recall at any point where that's been the turnoff point. And I certainly don't drag them out for, 6 months or anything like that. That doesn't make any sense at all. But recognizing that there are questions that can be awfully helpful to you in articulating your vision, especially if you're early on in your journey, where, you're learning how to pitch essentially, and not everybody is as diligent as other, not every investor is as diligent as others in terms of trying to understand what is it that you're presenting and, how much capacity do you have, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that that's a really good point. And also recognizing that, and not to cast a nefarious light on investors, but, they're investors, they may be looking at more than your business that's in the same space and trying to get competitive information from you as they're comparing you versus potentially somebody else in your space. And I have seen that. I certainly have not done that or have anyone in my circles doing that. But I've seen that happen to particularly early, relatively, I just call them inexperienced founders who are getting, who are in the very earliest stages of their, where when you have this excess of questions that are really not essential and pertinent to the investment, but more about your operations in a way that gets down to a detail that should not, be necessary for a decision on an investment. I have at least twice that I can think of, know of entrepreneurs that I've either advised or one of which I actually invested in, came back to me to tell me about this interaction she had with another investor. I said, that sounds wrong to me. That sounds really wrong. It sounds to me like they're considering somebody else in your space and they're trying to get competitive information for you to understand how well the other company that they may be thinking about investing in may be positioned. I don't know. It just sounds wrong. So, do receive, I know you're all, I'm sure, receiving questions with open minds and I'm trying to be helpful to the investor to get to their decision point. But there is a point of no return and you should determine what that is for you. From your side, so that's great.
So I would definitely echo, what I think it was Emily who said about being true to yourself. I would say that that's one thing I've just been that way from the beginning, and for me, that's an immediate filter to know who really is going to be compatible and not compatible from a support standpoint. And I think. Again, as I mentioned, we haven't gone for funding from the more VC angel investor route yet. Potentially we will. But what I've seen from other female founders is the investor tends to be placed on a pedestal, and the value of money seems to be like it's everything. I mean, of course, cash is king, but it's king, and there's other things that can be king as well. And so I think what I've seen from colleagues is this complete devastation at how a certain session has gone with an investor, and letting that just make you lose your entire confidence. And so I think overall, I think entrepreneurs should be really much more looking at an investor as someone that is their equal, and that it's a relationship, and we're both on the same level. And in general, I just feel like I know that a lot of investors out there are just not going to be compatible. And from the get-go, I'm prepared to know that my potential, investors are going to be really specific, very patient, really in tune and attuned to the topic I am working on. And I would just say, at the same time, I feel sometimes people underestimate the value of being scrappy early on. Maybe this is my NGO side, but we've been able to be very, very scrappy and still get a lot of traction. And so sometimes really we might feel like we need to go for big investments, but lots of studies also show that for early stage startups, very young entrepreneurs, smaller grants are more helpful in the early phase. And there's so many ways to get smaller grants sometimes to get the ball rolling. So I think that would be my tip to some other entrepreneurs and notably female entrepreneurs. It just seems like investment and investors is put on such a pedestal. And yes, it's critical and it's important. And some businesses might really need that big income at the beginning and investment. But I think there's also, sometimes ways to deflate that, to make it also, to take it less with that very heavy weight when you don't get it. And when especially, I will say that the only time I've had pushback has been from white older men who they'll ask me a question and I respond. They don't even look at me when I'm responding. They'll just turn their head away. Well, I mean, and it's striking because it's the stereotype, but it's there. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
That's really helpful. None of you have mentioned banks at all. Does anyone have anything to say? Have you had any interactions with banks?
Sure. Yes. So we needed purchase order financing, and we got purchase orders from Zappos as well as the Grommet, which was recently acquired by Ace Hardware. So very reputable companies. And we went to all traditional banking options to get purchase order financing. And it really boiled down to that we didn't have 2 years of tax returns. And the fact that we were, an angel and venture-backed company, so we were operating in the red, was just a turn off for the bank. And, they said it was something that they couldn't do. So we ended up turning to a local social entrepreneurship fund that gave us purchase order financing. But that was really frustrating, just getting the runaround from the banks and ones that we had longstanding relationships with.
Fundraising is obviously can be a grueling process. I mean, Emily, you mentioned that the grant applications like taking up a significant amount of time of your team. How much of your time do you actually spend on fundraising? But let's talk a little bit about your networks and what role your networks have played in your ability to fundraise from whatever source you ended up raising funds from. Aline, you want to start?
Networks and relationships are really important overall, if not everything, as they serve as starting points for investment, for sales, for building your company. So I would say, definitely having, the people who've invested or the organizations that invested in us in, I guess, non-dilutive equity, which is grants, have always been able to vouch for us and serve. I mean, our first competition, the first competition we won was a Columbia University competition because that's where I studied my master's. And of course, that first validation triggers so many others. So, and I think it really depends on the company. I would say that the route of competitions has been critical to also helping us get clients and helping get more users. And this is obviously particular to potentially our company and a certain profile. So we are definitely spending quite a bit of time in this type of funding strategy. More and more, we're trying to shift towards funding coming from our sales as well. But again, it's almost like it's a marketing tool as well. Competitions are a marketing tool, because when you're affiliated with the World Bank, when you're in a space with the World Bank, when you're in a space with the UN, especially from my work, that is relationship building, that is legitimizing, that is PR, marketing, all that stuff. So I would say that I think for depending on your company, really measuring all those benefits will play into also knowing whether putting that time into that competition is worth it.
So you evolved from the networks to the competition, and that's one part of your networks, but you did highlight, I just captured a few things. First of all, having the validation, not only being in the competition, but of the networks who will vouch for you. So whether it's individuals who have known you and the kind of work that you can do, and or universities or wherever that network may stretch to or come from. Secondly, you mentioned client referrals. Third, you mentioned competitions and sources of funding, as well as opportunities to market yourself in a big way. So those are four very big impacts of, your networks. I'm highlighting this too. I didn't preface it by saying, about 2 years ago, Harvard, I think it was a report in HBR, Harvard Business Review, that women's business networks on average constitute about 21 active members, whereas men's are 83 active members. And while those numbers may be, I look at those numbers of going like, well, I don't know any woman who doesn't exceed 21, because I'm well networked, but I know her well networked, whatever. But having said that, it does, the discrepancy in networks does make sense to me. And I think that it's something that we as women need to focus on for all of the reasons you said, but not the least of which is for funding. When I think back on the, 35, 40 years ago, when I started my first company in 1990, first company was self-funded, but my second company, if I had not had, at that point, frankly, the men in my network to vouch for me, who knew what I could do, who would introduce me to other investors. And we didn't, those days we weren't having these conversations. We didn't have Cartier to foster us. It just happened. And I was lucky enough to have had the corporate career that led me to have some of these contacts who were then willing to step up for me. Caitlin, your experience with networks in terms of contributing to your success?
A few different ways. I think that one is the way that we started to build our pipeline of investors is not too dissimilar to how you build a pipeline for sales. And so to be actually quite strategic about it. So we looked in a few different things. So we knew that we wanted to raise more sizable capital, and so wanted to kind of get into the investor space. So one, we looked at investors who had invested in similar companies or products. So who is investing in emergency response today? And there's plenty of companies in the US, Israel, elsewhere. And so we targeted investors who are actually familiar with that domain. Another one is that we look, because we're in East Africa, and in Africa, there's a whole set of investors that are focused on this geography, whether it's the Japanese are like really going long on early stage companies in Africa, to certain American, foundations or funds that have a geographic focus on the continent. So we also tried to narrow in on that. And I think the last one is just talking to entrepreneurs. I'm sure that everyone has built like a network of entrepreneurs within whatever kind of city or country they're in. But that was another good way, is just to always be watching like who's getting funded. Because I think the other, which is going back to your question before, Shelly, is always making sure that when you're talking to investors, they actually have money. We had so many conversations where they're like, oh, we're raising our fund. And it's like, oh, when are you going to be done closing that fund? And it's like 2 years later, it's like, well, we needed money yesterday, so that's not going to work. So I think also watching who is closing deals is a good indication that they actually are liquid and that they are ready and willing to make deals in the market and in like the space that you're working in. So that was another one. It's just like watching who's actually making investments active.
We only have a few minutes left, so I will ask Emily to share with us very quickly her network insights, and then spend 1 minute each on a lightning round. If you had one tip to give those folks who have joined us for this webinar, what would that be?
Sure, happy to kick off the last question. For me, I've built most of my networks by joining accelerators. My favorite, which I've joined, was Mass Challenge in the Boston area, which didn't take any equity, but provided me with really a stamp of approval, especially in the New England area. And then I've also done programs that are both women specific and technology specific. And I've built both my mentor and investor and really entrepreneurial friend network out of doing those accelerators. So I'm a huge proponent of those, as long as you feel like there's a real benefit add, whether that is funding or the network you can gain. And something I wish that everyone knew would just be my previous comment of being true to yourself. Put that stick in the ground and say, this is who I am, this is what I represent, and this is why I wake up every single morning to fulfill this mission. And if you can't be true to yourself, then you can't get others to join you and back you and believe in you and propel you forward.
For those listening in, and one thing that you would share, what would that be?
I think one thing, beyond obviously like believing in yourself and your vision and mission, which I think is like definitely step one, what Emily said, is once you've raised a round of funding, really get your investors to work for you. So we have all of our investors, as part of their investment, they have to raise money for us. And it's so gratifying to see sometimes how hard it is, but make them raise money for you. They have deep networks. And so every round of funding should come with a contingency on them raising funding.
I would again echo the importance of being true to yourself, and then surrounding yourself with people who trust and believe in you, but have a skill set that is completely opposite to yours. So they can complement you and really bring in that holistic, comprehensive approach. And I think that's something we're really working on at NaTakallam, really bringing in the talent and the skills sets that will complement, the very kind of more human and humanitarian and impact side of our work. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, all three. We obviously wish all of you tremendous success. One of you is doing such important work that's changing people's lives, saving people's lives in many cases. So thank you so much. We hope everyone here, as we are as appreciative of the Cartier Women's Initiative Awards that has brought this webinar to us all and brought us all together to really think about how do we support really critical women innovators like the ones you've just heard.